Okay, so we're back from the shoot, and the first thing you're going to want to do is obviously get your media from the shoot backed up. Now, I always make a habit of doing this as soon as I get back from any shoot, so that's it's the first thing that I do before I even unpack any of my gear or get anything on charge, or even make myself a cup of tea or a drink or anything like that. The first thing I do is just make sure that this media is backed up. So we're shooting on CF Express cards, so it should be quite quick to back up. The main reasons I'd back up straight away before I do anything else really is just a bit of peace of mind, just to make sure that the footage is good and it's safe and secure, that it's on a second location. So that's obviously the card and then my internal hard drive. So that's the kind of main reasons. Also, like checking through just to make sure that the footage isn't corrupted or there's nothing missing. It's much easier if you really need to organize a shoot if you let the person know as soon as possible. So, had this card been corrupted or anything like that, then if I got straight back in contact with Paul, it's going to be easier to be like, had an issue with the card, can we come back and film with you? So it's easier to do that, within a day or so of the shoot, rather than weeks and weeks later, when if it does take that long to get around to edit, then to be like, oh, really sorry, but the card's corrupted, can we kind of go back to it? Because I think for them it just shows a kind of lack of importance on the project. So if you do get back to them quickly, if there is an issue with your footage, then that's obviously going to go a lot better. So that's my main reason, is getting it checked, look through, make sure you're happy with the footage, and getting it on your external hard drive. The other thing is, depending on how much media you have, I know particularly these cards are quite expensive, depending on what you're shooting on and how often you're shooting, it frees up using that card. So I'm going to back up to my SSD, which is internal in my computer. I'm also going to back that up to my little RAID system that I've got on my desk as well. Now, just a note, one thing that I always make sure I do is always back up from your source media, your main media. So I wouldn't back up this onto my SSD and then from my SSD to my RAID system or my second drive. Reason being is that if I copy an error, or if there's an error in the copy going over to the SSD, if I copy from the SSD to another drive, it's just going to copy that error. So if I'm copying straight from the source, so from what I shot onto, then it shouldn't duplicate any errors unless there's an error on the card. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to grab my my little card reader out and get this backed up. Okay, so that is all backed up now. 60-70 gigs worth of stuff, so not a huge amount. Now, I did mention that I'm backing up onto an internal SSD. I would highly recommend just having your edit hard drive as an SSD, whether you're shooting for a 4K project or not. If it's just 1080, then it is going to make your life a lot easier because they are faster than a standard drive. So I'd really make sure that you grab some sort of SSD, be that external or internal. It's just going to speed up your workflow and just make your computer just a little less stressed in terms of playing back some of the footage and clips and stuff. More so if you are shooting 4 or 6 or 8K. But obviously if you're shooting kind of 6 or 8K, then you definitely need to make sure you've got the machine to handle that as well. So that's all backed up. I'm using a program that I recently kind of picked up called Kino. So I grabbed this because it's a really good way of organizing your footage. It plays back pretty much any media type. You can do things like give your footage a star rating if you want to kind of log it that way. You can put in metadata info, which is just information about each clip. You can rename in batch clips. It's just a really good way of organizing all of your clips before you go into edit. It's just kind of a handy step to do before you get into the edit process. What you don't want to do is import all of your footage into, for example, Premiere, if that's your edit software that you're using. You don't want to import it into there and then have to organize it from there, because if you have an organized folder structure, that's just going to keep you organized going through your entire workflow. So as I said, I have I've been using Canon now personally for just a few months. I use it for like, any of my kind of projects that I do. It's just really quite handy just to kind of go in there, separate my interview or piece to camera footage out from my B-roll. If it's all in one folder, it can get a bit messy, and you might end up missing one of the clips if it's not obvious which clips are kind of your piece to camera. Now obviously with the pool piece that we did that one interview section at the start, and then the rest was B-roll. So that, in terms of organization, wouldn't necessarily need something like Kino. But more kind of run and gun sort of stuff, where you are picking up like interview or piece to camera pieces on the go, what you're going to want to do is just make sure that you're not missing any of those. So you can put all of those in a separate folder, all your piece to cameras in one folder, all of your B-roll in another folder. You can even go as far to separate out your 25 and 50 frame stuff, so you know what's what. So yeah, it's just having a good organized folder structure is really, really important, and it will massively help out with your edit in the long run as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through a lot of my footage here to check to make sure that I'm happy with it. So I'm just going to use Kino before I go into Premiere, organize it into the folders as I mentioned, just to make sure that it's in the right place, I'm happy with the B-roll. I pick out some of the shots that I really like, and I might put those in a separate folder. But I'm just going to go through and kind of just pick out the bits that I like, make some kind of mental notes on some of the clips that I think really stand out, have a listen back to Paul's interview on this before I then move into Premiere. Okay, so I've now gone through a lot of my kind of footage and clips and everything like that. I just got it organized into a couple of different folders. So I've got one organized for my B-roll and one for my interview, so I can now drag those into Premiere and start organizing my timeline. So I'm going to open up my project. So I've already created the project itself. I usually do this ahead of the shoot and just set my folders up ready to go. And I've also been onto my stock music service that I use, and I picked out a handful of tracks. So I kind of tend to do that ahead of the shoot because I know the type of style that I'm going to want to bring into this. So I've downloaded a couple of tracks already, ready to go into my mix, into my edit. So, but I won't tend to touch the music side of it until I've got my interview down. That's really my kind of most important part that I'm going to do. So just going to open up Premiere now and get into the edit and cut down the interview first of all. Now the interview itself is about 19-20 minutes long, so it's not a massive amount of time, but I know I roughly want to get the edit down for between 2 to 3 minutes. So what I'll start doing is I'll go through the edit itself or through the interview itself and just listen to the actual interview and really just pick out the kind of key bits that I want to go into the interview itself or for the narrative of this story. And I'll do that in a couple of different ways. Now, depending on the length of it, I mean, this isn't particularly long, and I know a lot of the content of it because it's still quite fresh in my mind. So what I'll probably do is just go through and I'll clip out the bits that I want, or at least the chunks that I want. And then I always do this in one timeline. So my interview segment is in one individual timeline, and then I'll make another timeline for the full edit. So I then copy my cut down interview into that edit. So this is going to be a 1080 output, as we discussed in one of the first videos. So I already know that, and I did shoot a lot of the footage in 4K, just as I said, to kind of give me that option of like cropping in if need be, because I was only shooting with one camera, especially with the interview. Just having that kind of push and pull with the kind of size of the footage just really does help if I do need to kind of do a cut within the actual audio and, you know, bring that kind of punched in shot as my second shot. So as I'm going to go through the interview now and then cut that up into the segments that I want, and I'll kind of talk you through as we go along with my kind of process and thought process with cutting down the interview. Okay, so I've now cut out the 4 additional audio tracks, and I've linked the footage together again just so I can work with this one quite clear audio channel, so I can really see as I look along the waveform exactly where my kind of peaked segments are, Also, looking at the waveform really helps me in terms of cutting out my voice in the recording as well, so I can really just skip to the important parts of Paul talking, and I can see which bits are him kind of talking to camera and which bits are just me kind of asking the questions. So I can cut me out straight away because Paul put context into most of his answers, so my voice really doesn't need to be in the edit at all. So I'll go through and I'll kind of cut those out. I can jump from segment to segment and just make sure I'm only listening to the answers, and that helps me kind of keep my narrative edit time down as well, so I'm not spending ages sifting through stuff. So another quick tip in terms of like sifting through this quite quickly is that you can use the J, K and L keys. Now the L key will play at normal speed. If you hit the L key again, it will play a little faster, and hit the L key again, it will play it even faster still. If you hit the K key, it'll pause it, and if you hit the J key whilst it's playing, it'll either pause it or slow it down based on what speed you're playing back at. So I normally play a lot of my interview stuff back at like double speed, so kind of 2 hits of the L key, and that will just speed through. It's like the right pace to be able to hear what they're saying, but also so you can kind of scrub through the kind of interview segment at a slightly faster pace. And then I can just make sure I can listen to the contents of what's being said, and I can make the cuts in a clear space. Because I've worked on this in terms of I did the interview, because I know what Paul said, it's easier for me to kind of listen out to stuff. If it's something I haven't been involved with in terms of the shoot, so if it's like an edit that I'm doing only, then I won't really kind of do that, because I want to listen quite closely to what's being said in the interview. Whereas I know like a lot of what Paul said because it's still quite fresh in my mind, so I can scrub through the audio quite efficiently and not miss anything. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to cut the interview down now into the segments, and as you'll kind of see as I work my way through, you'll see how I like pick out the bits that I want in terms of like pulling those onto the kind of timeline that I want. Okay, so one of the first things that I've done is I've just pulled out an introduction from Paul. Now he did give me a couple of introductions on the day. So one was quite a long, in-depth introduction to himself, his name, what he does as his like main job, as well as the kind of pen making side of things. I did get him to give me like a slightly shorter answer, just real kind of succinct little who he is, what he does. So I've gone for that one because, as I said, the kind of narrative of this I want to be around like 2.5 minutes. So what I don't want is a really long introduction to who he is. So the kind of succinct answer for me is really the one that works. Now, the first thing I've done, as you'll see, I'll be kind of zooming in and out of the timeline, so making the timeline kind of larger and smaller. I've dropped down the audio so I can kind of see the kind of peaks on the bars quite clearly. So I will go through and I'll pick out the little segments that I want, and typically that will be from the very start of what Paul says of that segment to the end, and then I'll cut it down further from there based on the kind of narrative that I want and how much information from that one answer that I actually want to go into the final piece. So I'm going to start working through now, and I'm going to pull out all of the bits that I want, and I'm going to make a separate little piece which is just at the start here, which just has all of Paul's answers that I want to be in this final piece. Now that might end up being 5 minutes, it might end up being kind of 10 minutes long, but it at least gives me the first cut down of what it is that I want to do, or what I want to go into the narrative of this story. Then I can cut it down further from there. I'll keep cutting it down until I get to a point where I'm pretty happy with, the 2.5, 3, even maybe even 3.5 minutes in length for the piece, and then I'll move that into my main timeline for the final edit. And then what I might do whilst there is actually just cut out small segments based on kind of what supporting footage I've got for the piece, or kind of what I feel needs to be like kind of heard or seen on screen. So we'll start, and I'll just go through the full interview now in terms of cutting it down and get a much shorter piece altogether.
From all sorts of kits that are available out on the market, your ballpoint pens, rollers, or flat pens.
So as you can see, as I'm going through the edit itself, One of the things that I am doing is when I pull out a clip that I want, I will have in mind where roughly I want it to go within the actual narrative itself. So one of these earlier clips was actually later on in the interview, but I just felt that it fitted quite well after Paul's introduction. So he's introduced who he is, and then he's said how long he's been making pens for. So that fits in quite nicely. So I'll start building the actual narrative from Paul's interview very early on in the stage of the edit. So it's not like I'll pull out all my favourite clips and then reorder them. I'll try and reorder them as I go. I'll always kind of constantly listen back to my kind of order that I've got, maybe cut down little clips that I've kind of pulled out already and just make them a little more succinct in terms of Paul's answers back to me. But yeah, so I'll work through and I'll kind of try and build the narrative side of the edit as much as possible whilst going along the kind of edit process of cutting down Paul's interview. So I've got the kind of main part just at the start here, and then Paul's kind of full interview, which I'm kind of chopping up. I'm not changing the order of the full interview, which is later on in the timeline, but what I'm doing is just making sure that, you know, if I do need to go back to an kind of unedited version of it, or one that hasn't been cut down, I might have cut the chunks, you know, put a cut mark in the start and finish of each sentence, but I won't have played around with the order. I won't have deleted anything from that main kind of interview at the end of this sequence. But what it will allow me to do is kind of go back to that if I feel I've missed something, or I remember hearing something that feel that, you know, that comment or those words might fit really well in this segment here. I can go back to the main interview without having to go back to the clip in my bin. So yeah, I'm just going to carry on working through, and hopefully within the next kind of 20 minutes, half an hour or so, I'll have kind of my main narrative down and in an order that I'm really happy with. Okay, so we're now at the point where I've gone through the whole of my narrative, the whole of the interview with Paul, and I've pulled out all of the segments that I feel make a really nice kind of narrative for my film. I've picked out parts that introduce himself, obviously at the start of it, who he is, what he does, his journey into kind of pen making. I've included that in there. Some of the kind of more interesting projects he's worked on, there's a really nice story within that. So that's in the kind of narrative cut down, and just like, it's really important to kind of pick out a really nice kind of ending, and I think I've got that within the story. So what I've also done is started to gap some of that out, and by that I kind of mean, you know, what you don't want is just a continual conversation or continual just segment after segment after segment with no gaps in it. You need to give the interview a little bit of time to breathe, something where, you know, you can inject that nice B-roll into it. So doing kind of gapping it out or putting like little breaks or pauses in, just kind of for the viewer to have like a little reflection time, is really nice to kind of put in, and I would put this in now. I'm also in this stage kind of get a little ahead of myself sometimes. But I really like to see or get in my mind how my footage is going to look at the end of it. So I'm now going to bring in an adjustment layer and start kind of grading the footage itself. Now, an adjustment layer is what I use to kind of bring in that like color and contrast, taking it from C-log, which was what we shot in the log format, to like a more kind of finished look to the actual footage as well. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to bring in an adjustment layer. I'm going to bring in one of my color grading tools. I'm going to go through the settings and have a little tweak around to get to somewhere that I'm really happy with in terms of the look. I do find that kind of gives me a bit more inspiration when I see kind of it like part graded, because log footage is quite flat. It's not that interesting to kind of look at. So having that kind of graded or part graded kind of look to your interview just really helps me in terms of like get that inspiration in terms of like what I'm going to bring in for my B-roll, or kind of what direction I can kind of push it in towards for the kind of final grade as well. So it just kind of gives me that like kind of energy that I need in terms of like putting a nice little edit together, just to kind of see that final piece. I'm a very visual person, being a kind of camera operator or filmmaker, so that really does help. So I'm going to bring in an adjustment layer now, bring in my color grading tools, and that's just going to start working through the grade itself. So straight away I've put on just a basic adjustment layer. What I'm using to grade in this instance, it's not something I always use, but I quite enjoy using this, and the plugin that I'm using is called Film Convert Nitrate. I've used it for a few years, and it's just a really nice way of kind of bringing like a filmic look. As I said, I don't always use this, I use it on some projects. I just felt like that kind of film stock look, but not overdone. It's going to be really nice for this piece with Paul, because as I said, it's quite organic. Typically I just use Lumetri, which is the built-in one in Premiere, and I'd grade using that. So I'd put in a conversion LUT, so from C-Log, so the log footage, to Rec 709, which is a workable color space, and then kind of go from there and create another kind of creative adjustment layer. But yeah, I'm going to use Film Convert Nitrate. As I said, quite like using it. I'm going to have a look through the different kind of film stocks that's available and tweak things like the curves. Now, the kind of color grading stuff is something that I've picked up over the years of kind of filmmaking. So it's not something you're going to want to jump into straight away if this is your kind of first film. So what I would recommend is, if this is your first one, then shooting in like an HLG, so or a kind of cine-like, something that doesn't involve as much kind of push and pull with your grade, because you can very quickly be kind of swamped by how much you need to put in, or how much time you need to put into the actual grade itself. So, you know, there's no problem at all with shooting in something like an HLG or a cine-like format, which is pretty much all the way there in terms of its look. And then kind of going from there. I think getting the narrative down and supporting it with the relevant footage is way more important than shooting in a log format and grading it. You can still add a look to kind of HLG shot footage or cine-like footage, or whatever kind of color profile you shoot. If you can still put a look to it, so you know you don't have to have it looking exactly as it came out of the camera and on your card. You can still kind of have a play around with it, but you just don't need to go in depth as if you're shooting on a kind of log format like what I've done here. Okay, so I've been working through and I've actually created 2 adjustment layers because I wanted to have a look in kind of 2 different ways. Now, every time I do something major to my timeline, what I'll do is I'll duplicate it and I'll put it into another version, because what I don't want to do is do something that's quite drastic and then it turns out that I'm not 100% happy with it, or I preferred the previous version, and then it's difficult to get back there. So I'll always, before I do like a big kind of step, or if I've done like a big step, I'll just kind of save at that point and then just create another version. So currently on version 3, so this is my interview cut down version 3, and this is because I've got two kind of grades on here. As I said, I've done this over 2 different adjustment layers, so I can switch between the 2 because I just kind of want to compare the looks between them. And that's typically how I work. I want to just, you know, get to a point that I'm really happy with the grade, and then just see what happens if I push it a little bit further, or how can I make it a little bit more cinematic, or how can I bring in something that's like slightly different without kind of undoing the work that I've done. So it's like creating little snapshots of your kind of edit or your grade, and then kind of being able to move on from there. And if you're not happy with it, going back to it. So yeah, I've just done that. So as I said, I'm on version 3. I'm happy with the version that I've got. So the interview and the and the kind of grade that I've done, or at least the initial grade that I've done of the interview itself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another sequence, and this is going to be my main edit sequence. And I'll be able to kind of work from this. I'll be able to start bringing in things like music, sound effects if I need to, and obviously the B-roll. Now the B-roll is going to sit under a separate grade as well. Because I was moving around Paul's workshop quite a bit, I was pointing in different ways. At one point Paul had the internal lights on, so that would have thrown the white balance off ever so slightly. Even though I was using that grey card, I want to just make sure that all the clips match as closely as possible. And then when the sun was coming in and out, it was changing the exposure like mid-shot and stuff. So I'm going to want to grade or put an adjustment layer over each of those shots just to kind of balance them out and make sure there aren't any shots that particularly stand out that might be, slightly more magenta than the others, or slightly more green, or slightly like warmer or cooler. So that's why I use kind of separate ones, so I can just make sure that all of my shots that I've got look very, very similar for my B-roll. So yeah, I'm now going to copy this interview over to my main timeline sequence, along with the kind of grade that I'm happy with, and then I'm going to start populating it with the other bits. Okay, so I've copied over my interview, as I said, with my adjustment layer on there. So I've done that already. One thing I do quite early on, once I've got my narrative, is actually put in my music as well, because I feel that my music really helps kind of drive the story, and I'm going to want to edit around that based on where it kind of ebbs and flows. So the kind of more energetic parts of the music, those bits I'm going to want to put like the kind of more key like pivot points of his interview. I'm going to want to make sure that those sit around those bits. Now, I don't always just grab a track from my kind of subscription site and then just chuck it on. The one that I use will allow me to download stings or segments of it, so I might build a song using those. I might take the original song and cut it up to kind of fit the narrative that I want. It's not very often that I'll just take the song and put it on and be done with it. So I will have a look at that just to see if I can kind of change the pacing of it, so I can bring in the kind of higher energy segments where I need them, rather than being dictated by the song as to where my higher energy moment should be. So I'll start kind of working through the song itself, and also that'll help me pace it out as well, and just to make sure that the song itself is the right length, and and just kind of work through and just make sure also the ending is good, and make sure that there's a nice segment that I can kind of end that on. The other thing is that I won't always just use one song. So sometimes in edits, depending on the story and depending on how long the final piece is, I can use 2 or 3 or 4 songs in a single edit. And I'll just use like segments of those based on what I need. Now this is a fine art in itself in terms of like picking 4 songs or 3 songs that kind of match in terms of like the kind of feel that you want from it. Going from a very kind of somber or kind of quite low-paced song to something really quite fast-paced and maybe in a different key or different time signature. That can be quite jarring if you don't do it right. So that in itself is a fine art, just getting the kind of music right in it. With the initial selection of music, as I said, I'll always have something in my mind with what I want, so that'll often go down to the kind of feel of the piece that I'm doing. Very much I get a vibe from the person by talking to them in my initial stages, what it is that they do. Paul's work is very organic. It's with kind of tangible physical materials, very often natural materials. So what I want is something that kind of reflects that, and I feel something like a piano piece, something maybe a little orchestral would really kind of help with that story. If it was something completely different, like in the technology sector, for example, then I'd want something that kind of pulls into that kind of dynamic or that kind of feel. So I wouldn't just go with like one song type that fits kind of everything. There's definitely each type of film has its own needs in terms of what music is going to support it. So I'm going to go through and just have a listen to the song, just make sure I'm happy with it, and start pacing out where I want pieces of Paul's audio to be, and just make sure there's like nice gaps in there as well. And then once I've done that, I will start putting in the B-roll. Now in terms of like levels for the audio, I won't touch the levels at all until I've like locked in all of my visuals and I'm really happy with where my narrative sits. So I'm going to want to duck the audio when Paul's speaking. That means kind of bringing it to a lower volume. So I'm going to want to do that, but I'm not going to want to do that now because I'll end up undoing a lot of my work later on. So I might just come in and just drop the full volume of the music to kind of 50% just so I can hear Paul's narrative. And then once I'm really happy with the B-roll that's sat in, any of the other visuals that's going in there as well, I can then bring the volume of the track back up to 100% and then start just ducking it down when Paul's kind of talking. Now I won't do that all the way through. What I'll likely do is, have the track at full volume right at the start, and then as soon as he starts speaking, I'll bring the volume down, and I'll keep it down for most of the way. So even if there's a pause, because it's quite a mellow piece of music, I won't just bring it up in volume and then back down. I just don't feel, for me, that works for every piece. For some pieces it works really well. I just don't feel it's going to work particularly well for this. I think I want to keep it, so the music just helps drive the pace of it and isn't like taking too much of the kind of limelight for this piece. Okay, so that's the music side of things kind of put in. I've gapped out a bit more with the interview. I've also cut down some of the interview segments and I've moved a couple around a little bit. So it's really now in a point where I'm very, very happy with the narrative itself. Some of the clips where I want like a little bit of Paul in the clip before he starts speaking, you can hear like a little bit of background noise or a breath from him beforehand. So I just kind of dropped the audio from that, so you don't hear anything until he starts talking, and that is covered up with the kind of supporting track that's in there as well. As I said, I've not touched the track in terms of changing the volume or anything like that, other than bringing it in a little bit lower to start off with. So now I'm going to start populating the piece with some supporting footage. Then I'll look at grading that individually, and then I'll look at putting things like sound effects in, though I probably won't put too much in. There's like maybe like one or two bits that I might put in. Most of that will be from what I recorded with my with the camera, so just kind of using that as my sound effects, and then I'll look at creating some titles and pop those in as well. So I'm going to start by going through my B-roll. Now I've got a separate bin for my B-roll, so I kind of always look through that, and then in Premiere it does tell you which clips you've used, so I'm just not duplicating parts through it. In terms of what B-roll I'm going to put in, obviously I shot it in a very linear format, so the steps that Paul goes through to make that pen, I filmed each one of those, and I'm going to want to make sure that I stick to that order as well. What I don't want to do is put in a clip of him, sanding or fitting the pen together right at the start when he hasn't even done any of the first steps. So I want to keep that kind of linear edge to it as well. Now I'm happy to show kind of clips of pens which I've shot at Paul's, so I'm happy to be able to put those in quite early on just to kind of show some of the things that he does, but I'll try and leave those to the end of the video based on the narrative, so that should work towards the end. Okay, so I put in my first lot of B-roll clips. I've introduced it with Paul kind of walking to his workshop, because I'm really happy with that. I've started ducking the audio where I need to right at the start, so I'll go through and I'll get segment by segment done. It might need like a little bit of tweaking, but I kind of know roughly where my audio from Paul is going to be, and it will stay around that area. So in terms of like bringing the audio in a little bit lower for when he talks, that might move like a few frames left or right, so that's really easy to do. So I've put in the introduction. So the introduction is Paul walking to his shed. I have put in kind of some establishing shots inside the workshop itself, some of the tools that he has there, some of the kind of bits of equipment that he uses. So I've started putting those together. I'm now going to start kind of going through the rest of the film, putting in the supporting footage I need for his kind of narrative. So he talks about kind of one of the pens that he works on. I have a nice shot of a newspaper clipping. So it's just identifying, you know, when you're on the shoot as well, you know, if they talk about something specific that you hadn't necessarily brought up in the interview stage, or like your kind of phone call with the person, they've brought something up. It's just, you know, making a mental note or even writing it down, or, you know, so you can go back to it and just say, okay, you know, you talked about this pen that you worked on that was, you know, quite a poignant part of your kind of work that you've done. Do you have anything that I can like film of it? Paul did send me some pictures ahead of this of how he made the pen. I'm not a massive fan of putting still images in video. It's just really hard to find like a really kind of compelling way or good way of putting it into the edit itself without going into something like After Effects, which is a lot more involved. So I will try and shoot it, and it also keeps with the feel of like that kind of documentary kind of style as well, rather than kind of removing or moving away from that with just dropping an image in, no matter how you do it. So I'm going to keep going through. I'm going to keep kind of putting in my B-roll, then I'm going to start grading the B-roll individually, or doing like a kind of master grade of the B-roll, and then kind of tweaking the segment of the clips as I go through. Okay, so yeah, worked pretty hard through the kind of B-roll side of things for the edit now. I think I'm pretty much there in terms of what I need the B-roll to be, kind of what I need to go in there. So I'm really happy with kind of how that's done. I've gone through and graded. I put a grade down, which was kind of a copy of the interview one. So I kind of copied that onto another adjustment layer. And then I've just tweaked it ever so slightly for the clips, just to make sure the clips are color balanced, and make sure that I'm happy with how each clip kind of looks, and make sure that each clip looks like the one before it and the one after it in terms of like the kind of color and saturation and contrast. There are some clips that are slightly brighter when I've shot like against the window, but that's just natural. So I've not tried to bring those down to kind of the darkness of like, you know, when Paul was using the drill. That's kind of a darker area of his workshop. So yeah, I've gone through. I'm really happy with like how it looks. My next step is kind of the finishing touches, and that's just retweaking the audio, so the music as it goes through. There is probably one sound effect that I just want to put in as well, and then it's just like looking at the titles. I will always put like a title at the start, and in this case I'll put something at the end as well, and just kind of putting the name of it in. So how I do that, there's various kind of plugins that you can use for you know, moving titles and stuff. You can put those in if you want to, much like the start of this video. So that's a plugin for a moving title. And you can just change the text. You can change the font. They're fine, but you know, they work. They have their purpose. For something like this, I want something that has a bit more kind of style to it, so it's a bit more stylized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into kind of Affinity Photo, which I quite like using. I'm just going to use the text tool in there to build like a couple of titles, so an intro one and an outro one, and then I'll export those as PNGs and I'll just fade them in. So it's a real quick, simple, easy way of doing something that looks, I think, looks pretty good. You know, they don't necessarily need to animate on. You know, that is a lot more involved. And if you're at a kind of beginner level, if you have something like Premiere, then chances are you'll be using Photoshop. I use Affinity because I bought it ages ago, and I'm just very, very familiar with the platform, so I'm going to use that myself. So I'll pick out a couple of fonts which I've already picked out. I wanted something that's quite cursive because obviously Paul's a pen maker, and just something that kind of complements that. There's a nice clean text to kind of go with that, and I picked out a couple of colours that I want. So yeah, I'll export those as individuals, individual PNGs, so they have a transparent background. So as I said, I can just fade those in at the start and at the end. So I'm just going to jump into Affinity now, and I'm going to make those and then get those exported. Okay, so what I've done in my top monitor here is I've exported a frame that I want to put the title over, which is one of the intro frames with the grade on it. I've done that in Premiere, so I've exported an individual still, so it's 1920 by 1080. I've made a 1920 by 1080 size Affinity document, which I'm going to put my text on. I picked my color out, and my two fonts, and as well as the kind of naming. So Paul's name at the top, and then I've gone with the pen maker as the title of the piece. So I kind of made that. So I've made those as individual layers, the two bits of text. The reason I've exported the still is just to make sure that it sits over that visual quite well. My text originally for the kind of cursive, the pen maker section, was black, and when I kind of put that over this kind of exported still image, you just can't read it, and kind of, you know, short of like creating a horrible outline to it, for example, the cleanest thing to do was to change the color of the font itself, because that is really where I want the kind of text to go over. So I've made this. I'm gonna turn the layer off from the background. So that's the layer that I exported from Premiere. So I'm going to turn that layer off in Affinity, and just export the Paul's name as an individual PNG and the pen maker as an individual PNG, and then I bring those into Premiere, and I can add them to the start of my film. I probably won't bring those straight away. I'll probably bring those in towards the end of the clip, so they disappear when the clip cuts. Okay, so I have now brought in the visuals. I've also made one for the end card, so it's just a thank you to Paul. I put in because he did give up his time. You know, he gave up a whole day of his weekend for us to kind of film this. So obviously, you know, thanking them within that is really good. Nice thing to kind of do. And anyone else that's involved, kind of be happy to kind of put those. But, you know, make your own call on what you want to put at the end of it. You don't even have to put anything at the end of it at all. You can just kind of fade it out or leave it as a cut at the end. I've also put in the sound effects that I wanted, which is just some kind of ambient bird noises. I brought those right down, so I don't want them to be like too dominating. I just want them to be backgroundy. And then as soon as we get into the actual inside Paul's workshop, they kind of just fade out, and then, you know, there's no more sound effects really needed. It's just Paul's voice that kind of carries it, and then the background music. I did experiment with putting in some other sound effects that I'd recorded on the day, but I just didn't feel personally that they worked that well. I found them, even at very low levels, to be a little bit distracting. But kind of take it, you know, sound design is really important, and kind of make your own mind up in terms of what it is that you feel that you need to add into it. I think in some instances it works really well, but just this, it just didn't feel like it was something I wanted to put in. As I said, I did try it, and it's worth trying, but it just didn't fit and didn't sound right for me. Okay, so we are now at the end of our edit. I've put in the titles, I put the sound effects piece that I wanted in, I've sorted out all the audio. It's all in a really good place. I'm really happy with it. So I'm just going to kind of sign off now from the kind of final piece. I really hope you've enjoyed the kind of 4 pieces before this and this final piece today. Really hope you've enjoyed it and you've got a lot out of it. Now, if I was to leave you with my kind of 3 tips for the kind of post-process side of things, is first of all, get your footage backed up on the day of the shoot. Now be that on site to like an external portable hard drive, or as soon as you get back home, just get the footage onto another place and also back it up onto a second place. So you've got it in two places. That frees up your memory card so you can go out shooting again, but it also means that, you know, if one of the hard drives you've backed up to fails, you've got a second space that it's saved to, and there's no kind of heartache in terms of needing to go back and shoot it or just losing the project altogether. So that's my first tip. Second tip is just really kind of get that narrative down to something that you're very, very happy with. Have, like, right at the start, kind of have in mind the type of length that you want this to be. Think about that during the kind of stage where you're putting the questions together. You know, you can even write out a sample narrative of what you want the kind of end piece to be. You know, you'd have already had your interview like over the phone with the person who you're going to be filming, so you can get that narrative down before you've even shot anything. You can get the kind of, at least the you know, I want my introduction to be this is the type of thing that I want him to say or them to say. You know, we've talked about this story, I want that story in there. This is the kind of thing that I want towards the end. So you can kind of chunk out that narrative even before you've shot anything. So yeah, get the interview down to like something really good that you're very, very happy with, and then cut it down even more. So, you know, you can take out some of the ums and ahs and stuff. Some of those are nice to have in because it, there we go, it shows like the reflection of the person who's talking to camera. Some of them are nice to have in because it kind of gives that like breathing space and it doesn't like force the pace to be faster than what it needs to be. But it is good to kind of cut some of those out so it's just, you know, it's just quite succinct. It gives you that nice flow through from start to finish. And then my third tip is just, you know, picking a song. This is like really important, picking a song and supporting audio segments that kind of fit with your piece. It's really important to kind of get that right. It doesn't matter if you're shooting in, you know, kind of one of your main like pre-done color profiles in your camera. So that's irrelevant. Like if you're shooting in that or you're shooting in log, that's kind of how it is, and you have to do the work to that. But the audio is so important, and going and picking out a really nice song, not just going onto like a free stock site and just getting whatever's on there, because you'll have heard it a million times across different other like platforms like YouTube. You'd have heard that same song because it's free, used over and over again. So I think picking the right song for that piece is really important. Getting a subscription to, especially if you're doing regular kind of pieces like this, getting a subscription to something that's quite good and has good music on is good, because you've got a huge library of stuff that you can pick from. Often when I'm kind of searching through for other bits, I'll create little folders on my stock music site of just music that I like, and I can kind of come back to it, and it's like this, you know, little hand-selected piece from myself for, you know, a later on project. So yeah, get the music that suits the piece, that has the same kind of feel and tone to the kind of story that you're putting across. So yeah, so they're my 3 tips. Really, really like to see kind of what you guys are shooting based off the back of these 5 parts. So don't forget to kind of tag Wex Photo Video in for any kind of pieces that you create. Tag them in on YouTube. Make sure you share anything you create with those. And here is the final piece, Paul Turner, the Pen Maker. I hope you enjoy it.
My name is Paul Turner. In my spare time, I hand make pens. I've been making pens now for approximately the last 12 years. I first got into them with a pen kit that my other half bought me for Christmas, and it's come on from there. I've progressed it on to the stage now where I'm making pens out of a bigger range of materials than I did when I first started, and exploring new avenues of what can be turned into a pen. I was entrusted with a piece of aluminium sheeting which had come from a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber from World War II. The people who entrusted me with it knew exactly what aircraft it came from, and it came from an aircraft called Forever Yours. And that process was an interesting one because it took me into the realms of things I'd never done before. And it now resides in the 100th Bomb Group Museum in America. There is quite a few tools that are necessary, that are over and above what you would normally buy if you were going to be just doing normal lathe turning. I'm not saying these things are totally necessary, but they do make your life a lot easier, and they do mean that your accuracy is far better. Typically I make ball pens, rollerball pens and fountain pens. Fountain pens are my one go-to love. I've always loved pens, and especially fountain pens. I find them fascinating things. I've made pens for weddings, for the bride and groom. I've made pens for people's birthdays, specific birthdays. So anything like that, anything commemorative, that's a very, very popular way to go, because there's something that people can keep. Some people won't ever use it. It will just sit in a presentation box in a cupboard, but it will always invoke memories.